The State by Heinrich Pesch, excerpted from the Lehrbuch der Nationalökonomie, Volume 1. 1. The reason for and origin of the state. The innately social nature of man by no means exhausts itself in that original form of society which we call the family. Suppose that two Europeans, hitherto completely unknown to each other, were to encounter each other in the Sahara Desert. They would immediately take pains to inform one another about how they could help one another in their plight, and how they would be prepared to assist one another. If one noted that the other harbored ignoble intentions and was only trying to promote his own interests, he would promptly inform him that he was ignoring the laws of civilized human conduct. Moreover, we do not need to romanticize about an odyssey in the Sahara in order to recognize how nature itself leads a person to go beyond the confines of the family circle and to establish contact with his fellow man. Is language, for example, confined to the immediate domestic household? Can I not also share my views with others, make clear my needs, consult with them, make plans, help them, and be helped by them? That leads to a recognition of the most deep-seated bases for the political society which we call the state. Undoubtedly, the individual state is the direct product of history. However, this development, which repeats itself time and again in history, along with its end result, would be inexplicable if we did not go beyond the historical origins and causes which give rise to one or the other individual state, and take into account the universal social needs and impulses of human nature. Taken as he is, man is in need of still other social relationships besides the family and the family circle. In order to lead a life which befits his human dignity, his social nature, in its capacity for fulfillment, time and again directs him beyond the family toward the higher, more powerful, more comprehensive circle which the state represents, in order to realize his human goals which, if it were not for the state, would remain unattainable ideals. 2. The historical development of the state, as a rule, stems originally from the patriarchal family. That was the opinion of Aristotle, and also of Cicero, who regarded the family as the wellspring of the city and the seedbed of the state. If the sons of the first family wished to remain in the house of the original father, or if, as Aristotle expressed it, while preserving a loose bond they were to establish a colony revolving around the father's house, the related circles would extend farther and farther until there would finally end up being an ever broader kind of community alongside the original paternal household. It is clear that in such family complexes a common authority would have to emerge. Security, law and order, and protection against external enemies would make some public power indispensable. No nation that we know of was completely without political organization. As a rule, the succession of the head of the household was conferred on the firstborn. Thus, the first conquerors were always heads of families or of clans. This rise of clan leaders stemming from family authorities is still evident among the Arabs, specifically among the northern Arabs, the so-called Bedouins, where even in our own time, genealogies continue to command the greatest attention. The first conquerors became kings whenever more clans united themselves, along with their leaders, under the leadership of someone, either for their warfare or because of some set of local circumstances which appeared to make it necessary, or because colonies were being established. That is how the Babylonian and Assyrian nations arose. The Medes lived under clan leaders until they rose against the Assyrian king Sardanapal, with Arbaces as their common military leader. The Lydian kings were originally tribal leaders from the Atiades, Heraclidan, and Mermnadan dynasties. Wherever the Phoenicians or the Egyptians settled as colonists on the shores of Greece, with its many bays, or on the islands of the archipelago, the leaders of those kinds of expeditions were naturally the best organizers of such settlements, and a hereditary rulership was derived from this. The dynasties of Cadmos in Thebes, of Kekrops in Attica, of Inachos in Argos, of Minos in Crete were probably of such an origin, one cannot rule out the possibility that certain states arose as a result of voluntary agreements. Overcrowding often led to emigration, or sometimes disasters led people to seek their fortunes elsewhere. One tribe pushed another out, and the various countries and parts of the earth changed ownership. Such changes occurred on a grand scale in the form of the migration of entire nations, both in prehistoric and in historical times. When those kinds of developments occurred, older states and forms of state were simply overrun. New structures and conditions replaced the old, whether by forceful measures on the part of some mighty conqueror or by free agreement among independent people. In such cases, states could arise on the basis of a more or less voluntary agreement. Examples of this kind are to be found in recent history. Thus, for example, the large numbers who immigrated to California elected a council in 1849, which was entrusted with the task of drawing up a constitution. That was then ratified by the people and a new state was established. 3. The state as a geographical entity, as a portion of humanity occupying a piece of land. Historically, states were not always confined to some particular piece of territory. Often they extended into neighboring territories without regard to geography. In that way, various kinds of territory were brought together to make up a politically powerful force and an economic unit. The historical sense and economic unity vis-a-vis other countries bind some widely diverse parcels of land together more tightly than natural peculiarities are able to segregate them, and the political boundaries become more significant in economic and commercial life than the physical boundaries, no matter how distinctive the latter may be. Adolf Ott made a comparative study of the ancient, medieval, and modern state in the Staatslexikon der Gesellschaft. We are able to derive from that work, which is highly instructive precisely because it was comparative, certain significant ideas, in particular about the approach which is so important for our discipline. 4. The relationship of the individual to the state. The Hellenic state was essentially a city-state. Thus, the interests of individuals remain closer than is the case in the broader political communities. They never reached the point where they had to set limits on rights between individuals and the state. Actually, the citizen enjoyed a sphere of activity which was free of the state's intervention. However, there was lacking an awareness of the legal character of that sphere, which was independent of the state's influence, and therefore there was no express legal recognition of that freedom. Beyond that, a shadow side emerged from the fact that slavery existed, with its lack of rights, and with the absence of any proper recognition of the rights and value of the human person. Like the Greek state, the Roman state possessed an intrinsic juridical unity. Despite all conflicts among various classes, the recognition prevailed in every era that, no matter how many different organs there was still one single omnipotent state, the imperium, the majestas, and that all others enjoyed merely a derivative legitimacy. The right of the human person as such also did not gain recognition in the Roman state. The Roman citizen, to be sure, enjoyed a certain sphere of individual freedom, even though there was no legal awareness of that or any corresponding body of law. Specifically, there were two limits on the absolute state. There was the independence of the Roman family and private property. By and large, the sphere of responsibilities toward the state was a small one. However, corresponding to it, there were the claims of the citizens to services from the state, and participation in determining what the will of the state was. The later Roman Empire did not preserve the legal and political sphere of independence which existed in the older Rome. Public rights were diminished, and finally the citizen had no share at all in public authority, and no freedom of action toward it. Unlike the modern state, the medieval state did not stand opposite a mass of formally equal members. It was organized instead in manorial fashion, so that there was a hierarchy within this mode of organization, which along with privileged sanctuaries also preserved conditions of limited freedom. What I mean to say is that this reduction of freedom now eventually does not place persons and things entirely, or almost entirely, on the same level. The individual was not left isolated in his legal, economic, and social relationships without any intermediary between himself and the public authorities. In his associations and in his corporations, the individual had his immediate making and support and backing, and that is where he played his role. In the medieval state, the position of the individual is involved essentially in the concept of corporate and associational right. There were two organizations which embraced the individual without their free consent, the feudal society and the guild structure. Along with those, there was also a wealth of other free associations. The absolute police state of the early modern era represented a relapse back toward the ancient state of the Roman imperial era. This brought with it an intolerable excess of state sovereignty, and there was virtually no recognition of any legal limits to state dominion over its citizens and their associations. The excess of regulation gave rise to the desire for greater freedom, and it eventually put an end to the police state. The modern state is not organized hierarchically or manorially, but simply as a civil society of citizens. Individuals are free citizens who formally enjoy equal rights. Here, too, they stand vis-a-vis the public authorities with nothing in between. If the modern state is characterized as a state of laws rather than as a police state, that is intended to mean that the state itself delineates an area of freedom for the individual vis-a-vis the state by positive legislation, and that furthermore the state demands services and support from its citizens only in accordance with laws which the people have a hand in drawing up, constitutions, and on the basis of which it eventually also exercises and recognizes legal control over its executives. No one ought to suppose that the modern state is the highest fulfillment of what the organization of the state as a political society ought to be, either in principle or in practice. Unless we are badly mistaken, the evolution of the kind of organization which we have at present will also lead to the restructuring of the modern state into a more modern state with greater decentralization. On a basically secure foundation and essentially more exalted and free than the so-called modern notion of the state is the concept of the state depicted in Christian philosophy. In the latter, the state is not represented as the source of all rights. Individuals and families do not simply derive their freedom and their rights from the state. They have natural rights which do not come from the state, but which the state is called upon to protect. And beyond that, there are obligations in conscience toward the state, which provide a better guarantee of order than the simple application of external force does. That political state, in this view, constitutes a solidaristic unit and community. Progress lies in the direction of the Christian concept of the state. 5. The natural law basis of the state and its importance. H. Dietzel rightfully complains that in the area of contemporary political science, there are lacking any kinds of basic and universal concepts. He says, "The organic notion of a state is lost sight of because of the continuing evolution of political life on the basis of and according to the yardstick of given conditions. Certainly it is right to say that it is not possible to construct, a priori, an absolute, universally valid system of direct practical politics. There is no other method for the art of statecraft than the historical or relativistic one which attempts to accommodate the specific political guideline, and in fact the whole political system to concrete circumstances as much as possible, and even to derive it from them. But eventually, there emanated from the principle of relativity of practical ways and means the principle that there are no such things as absolute purposes and goals. To have no system became the new system. Lack of principle was elevated to the level of principle. And that unfortunate condition which such lack of principle results in and must of necessity lead to ran its course not only in politics. Geyer says, "If, like the sophists of ancient and modern times, we arrive at the point where we negate any deeper basis for law, then all ground has been cut from under political life and law generally. Positive legal and political science may then very well build its impressive structure and extend it to the minutest detail and with the greatest acumen, but it is built on quicksand. It then presents before our eyes, in an outstanding manner, a particular legal and political system as a fact of life, and we are able to survey its inner workings and construction. But there is no attempt to determine the extent to which that system merits our unconditional respect, reverence, and unqualified approval. If such a system were overthrown tomorrow by force and another put in its place, then an explanation of it has only historical value, and positive legal and political science has only to explain the new system which succeeds it in a scientific manner, even if it is a completely socialistic one. Trailing behind events, it must now present as correct what it previously presented as incorrect, and vice versa. The abrupt opposite of such an approach and conception is the constant endeavor on the part of those who try to overthrow what is, whether in their own selfish interests or for more noble reasons, and what is to prevent them from putting their ideas across by force once they have achieved the ability to do so. The mere fact that something has come to be historically and that it exists will certainly not stand in the way. We see that once law and the state are cut loose from their ethical moorings, or even if they just become indifferent in its regard, the question of what is right and to what extent order in social life should prevail all become contingent on who holds power, and they are resolved simply in terms of who is the more clever and energetic. Only if the sanctity of law is established and recognized as an ethical principle will it have the kind of support which it cannot achieve by any kind of force or duress. If natural law is not recognized, practical politics, e.g., all of our present-day social policy, will be merely a historically justified article of fashion, or, as the socialist would say, a product of the anxiety and need of capitalistic society. If the natural law is not recognized, every effective kind of protection of civil liberty will fail. If sovereignty were to mean that all potentials for expanding authority are at the beck and call of the state, then we would all be slaves of the state, and we would enjoy some little bit of legal leeway simply as a precarious concession from the state. No doubt about that. But who is there to put limits on the state's exercise of power if state sovereignty means not only independence from the estates, which are of a feudal and corporate character, but also beyond that from all forces which are outside of and above the state, even from the one which the medieval legislators have so beautifully and decisively designated as the ultimate and highest source of all law? If there is no recognition of a natural law, the state is left to its own resources. Its only underlying basis, then, is force and violence, which have to bow before the superior power and greater force of a successful revolution, and it would even have to yield in the name of law itself. It is not because it is the product of revolution, but because of its natural purpose, the common good, that a new legal state which may result from revolution can, in fact, achieve legitimacy. 6. Political society and its natural purpose. As is true of every organization, for the state too, purpose and authority are its twofold bond of unity. But what is the purpose of political society? According to Montesquieu, all states have only one common purpose, to survive, and beyond that, every state has its own peculiar historical purpose: world domination for Rome, war for Sparta, etc. However, that does not solve the problem of the purpose of the state. Even if each state develops its own peculiar purpose deriving from particular historical circumstances, the universal purpose of the state ranges far beyond simply its own self-preservation, since the state is, in fact, preserved only in order to achieve its true purpose. According to the simple and clear teaching of Christian philosophy, the state must provide the kinds of advantages and benefits for its members which they require, within the limits of the level of cultural development that they have attained, but which they cannot achieve by their own powers, by the capacities of their family, or other social bodies of narrower scope. It is precisely for that purpose, as we have seen, that the state appears on the scene, as a social body which is required by nature, because without the state man would lack much that is advantageous and necessary for his temporal welfare. Thus, the universal purpose of the state is removed from merely historical circumstances and from the mere arbitrariness of men. All individual objectives and special goals, as dictated by historic circumstances and situations, must subordinate themselves to this universal purpose, for which the state as such exists, and which it did not confer on itself, and which it can never disregard. That universal purpose must be a good, for only what is a good is the object and goal of human endeavor. Furthermore, it must be a temporal good, because the state's sphere of competence does not extend directly to the hereafter, but all of its activity is limited directly to the here and now. Thus, it has to be a good which cannot be achieved and safeguarded by individuals, families, and other organizations operating within the state, either not at all or not to a degree which is sufficient in terms of human and social needs. As the highest form of natural society, the state will therefore have a particular, unique social purpose, which appears as complementary or as the crowning achievement with regard to goals that can be achieved by individual or other social forces. All other members of society, in accordance with their own position and their own needs, must be able to share in the good which constitutes the social purpose of the state. In this sense, it must be a common good of the whole of society. For the state as a political society exists for all, and, in fact, for the sake of the good which it is able to provide and ought to provide. That good, however, is not simply the mere existence of the state, the preservation of its power, its own survival or fulfillment. We have only to recall here what was said earlier about the purpose of human societies. No society exists simply for the purpose of surviving or in order to fulfill its existence. To be sure, the survival of the state and the preservation of its power are important tasks, and even a primary one for rulers and the nation. But these do not add up to its highest objective, or the ultimate purpose of the state. They are merely the indispensable means whereby the state can fulfill its highest purpose. They are the necessary prerequisites and conditions for the striving of political society which we call the state, toward that good which is common to all members of society and which constitutes the real social purpose of the state. Thus, the ultimate purpose of the state, and also the purpose which provides the rule and measure in the political order, cannot be sought in what the state may do in order to safeguard and develop its own existence, unity, power, and efficiency, but in the civil order. The state does not exist for its own sake, but for its citizens. The purpose of the state, therefore, lies within the realm of civil welfare. It lies in the temporal welfare of the entire community of its citizens, to the extent that the combined power of the whole state is needed to provide, preserve, and fulfill the conditions for this welfare. It would be a mistake, however, if we were to regard the temporal welfare of its citizens as the purpose of the state without any restriction of any kind. Instead, what is needed in this regard are certain distinctions to separate in a proper manner the area of legitimate state functions from the sphere of private activity. The direct and positive actualization of the private good of individual citizens of and by itself lies beyond the limits of the state's purpose. That is so because a. Each person is the master of his own destiny. It is for that purpose that each person has received his capabilities and powers, so that he can achieve his private well-being by his own activity. From the state he looks for what is needed to make up for what he lacks, but not the suppression of his own private endeavor. B. Even if it tried to do so, the state could not accomplish the staggering task of directly seeing to the well-being of each individual citizen in a satisfactory manner. C. Finally, civil liberty would be the victim, because the supervision of all of private life would have to be the inevitable consequence of such an endeavor by the state. Now, if the state does not have the purpose of actualizing overall the welfare of individual citizens by its own positive and direct action, nevertheless, since the temporal welfare of all of its citizen members represents the goal imposed upon it by nature, the purpose of the state involves the indirect endeavor, i.e., making possible the general welfare by social means and institutions. In other words, the purpose of the state as political society consists in providing, preserving, and fulfilling the sum total of those public conditions and institutions which would provide, preserve, and enhance the potential of all members through their combined energies so that they may freely and independently achieve their true temporal welfare according to their own particular capacities and situations, and to preserve what they have achieved in an honest manner. The designated potential is the good which is common to all citizens of the state, and it constitutes the social purpose of the state. Therefore, if we speak about the public welfare as the purpose of the state, we infer two things. A. First of all, that the private welfare of the individual as a part of the whole cannot be the direct product of activity by the state. And then B. That the temporal welfare, insofar as it represents the purpose of the society, the state, is common to all citizens, i.e., no one of them may be excluded from it, and no one of them may be favored in the enjoyment of the common goods, which is to say that the good of the community as a whole ends up favoring one class or group of persons. In that way, the public welfare, along with the activity of individuals and their various associations operating within the bounds of the whole community, becomes the major means whereby the common good of the entire nation becomes actual reality. The essence of the public welfare is manifested by its ultimate ordering toward the well-being of all individuals and families. And that is so even though the direct positive actualization of the private welfare remains the business of the private individuals, excluding cases where people cannot help themselves. A kind of public welfare which goes contrary to the private welfare of the parts of the political society, the state, would be a contradiction. Being the public welfare, it ought to make possible the private welfare in a social manner, whereas it would actually be hindering it or making it impossible. There cannot be talk of genuine welfare in any area which operates in opposition to the welfare of a higher order, or if it involves injury to the moral order in particular, which represents the universal and highest end of mankind, principle of cultural unity. The expressions public welfare, welfare of the state, etc., have been picked up and used by rationalist thinkers in a very abstract manner. The welfare of the state was formally hypostatized in the process and elevated above the general welfare of the citizens, an ancient error of absolutism. People are here for the state and not the state for the people. There is no doubt but that the citizen must sacrifice property and even his very lifeblood for the state when this becomes necessary. But this is not the same as saying that the welfare of the state stands above the welfare of the community of citizens. It means instead, as we have indicated, that the preservation of the welfare of the state is to be regarded as an essential prerequisite for the general welfare of its citizens, which is the ultimate purpose of the state as a political society. The welfare of the state, in the narrower sense, as a prerequisite, the public welfare is a condition and source of the general welfare of citizens, and also this general welfare of the citizens itself are often designated per modum unius by the term common good, or general welfare. Even the words public welfare, general welfare, common good, etc. are frequently used interchangeably. 7. The public welfare is the purpose of the state. Two things are implicit in the public welfare or in its realization: protection and assistance. The state as political society is in fact based on the natural need of people for security and for the full realization of their capacities. 1. First of all, the state must make the necessary arrangements so that it can afford the requisite protection of all of its citizens. The actual exercise of the protective function applies to every individual, family, and individual corporate body in accordance with the particular needs of the situation. Without such protection for individual citizens when it is needed, there would be no security, and it would be impossible to provide for the temporal welfare and to safeguard it. Furthermore, if individual instances of injustice were not counteracted, then, by the mere fact of human malice, criminality would increase in a way that would jeopardize the survival of the state as a society. On the other hand, in the interests of order and public peace, the individual citizens cannot, as a general rule, be entrusted with the use of force to secure their rights. 2. So far as help is concerned, of and by itself, the state has to deal directly here with the entire community and not with individual persons. To the extent that the community of citizens or their groups are provided with the kinds of social benefits as would be possible only through the combined power of the state, the individual person as a member of society in and along with the community is able to work positively toward achieving his own private welfare by himself while sharing in those benefits and institutional arrangements. The use of force is involved only if the arbitrary exclusion of the individual from being able to take advantage of common social benefits would work to the disadvantage of the community. In certain cases and under given conditions, providing directly and positively also for citizens who would otherwise find themselves helpless becomes necessary. When and where, for example, private benevolence is no longer up to taking care of all of those who are in need, like the sick, the poor, etc., as is often the case in our time, then the public bodies must step in and provide for them with all of the means at their disposal. The welfare of the nation itself, its security, public morality, etc., aside from humane considerations, make it inconceivable that the poor and sick are left to their own fate, or without adequate help in their plight. That is when the public bodies are, without a doubt, in a position where they must put into operation the obligation in charity which is incumbent on private ownership to provide alms. And in the right kind of situation, that obligation may even be required by positive legislation, poor tax, in the interest of the public welfare, and also in the interest of individual persons who, despite the emergence of the customary public institutions, are prevented by personal misfortune from exercising their potential for acting on their own behalf, to provide for their own welfare, either momentarily or permanently. Obviously, public care for the poor must in no way replace or suppress private benevolence where this is adequate. Even the best care provided by the community, the province, or the state cannot replace free charitable actions. In our opinion, it does not follow from the observation that public care for the poor is principally and fundamentally only subsidiary, in other words, complementary to private charity, that public care may therefore move in only after public charitable endeavor proves itself wholly inadequate. Such public bodies, which have jurisdiction over the poor tax and perhaps also over the yields from pious endowments, are in a certain real sense the most capable representatives of those obligations for support which are incumbent upon property ownership originally. It would not present any real difficulty, as we see it, if private charity, charitable societies, etc., would in certain circumstances resort to public bodies for support. In that way, they could shepherd their own resources for the other ever-present needs which they face constantly. 3. The public welfare is regarded as welfare which is common to all insofar as all share in the protection of the state and in its help. That is not to say that help and protection are to be accorded to each citizen and to each social group in the same degree and in the same form. Particular needs and merits on the part of the various sectors of the state which are under consideration allow different responses according to the principle of distributive justice. It can happen, for example, that one social group, because of the particular situation in which it finds itself, requires a greater amount of legal protection and positive assistance so that it can even realize the possibility of working out its existence and of providing the well-being it needs for its life in society. The fact that the state takes special care on behalf of particular social groups in no way contradicts the purpose of the state, as we have presented that here, i.e. to see to the general public welfare of all together. On the contrary, there is no better way of providing for the general welfare than where, with due regard for the unique position of each of the various groups, the needs of all groups are taken into account as much as possible, and there is a prudent attempt to balance contending interests. In the application of this principle, Leo XIII, when dealing with the working class at the present time, made the following statement: "Whence it follows that all those measures ought to be favored which seem in any way capable of benefiting the condition of workers. Such solicitude is so far from injuring anyone that it is destined rather to benefit all, because it is of absolute interest to the state that those citizens should not be miserable in every respect from whom such necessary goods proceed." The same view was expressed by Wilhelm I in an imperial statement on November 17, 1881, where he wanted to develop the idea of what the purpose of the state was on the basis of Christian national life, rather than according to the then prevalent liberal theory, fostering and promising protection and positive action on behalf of the working class because of its oppression and helplessness. 4. When more recent political theory mentions the objectives of law and compulsion on the one hand, and cultural and welfare objectives on the other, we are as a rule back to the point of view which Christian philosophy has always upheld. However, the close relationship between the application of force and of law can lead to an unclear and therefore risky judgment about the relationship of political and civil order. There is no doubt but that the state has to have at its disposal the use of force in order to achieve its legal objective. Without force, it could not exercise in an adequate manner care for the first of all common needs of human life together in a nation, life according to the legal order within the state, the nation, and the national economy, and externally toward other states. Yet, as we have seen, force is to legal purpose as the means is to the end, and thus one cannot simply be equated with the other. Even for the cultural and welfare objectives of the state, the elimination of barriers to legitimate social activities, the provision of public arrangements and institutions, etc., the power of the state is a necessary prerequisite. However, exaggerations which, in the absence of a basic limitation, could easily lead to absolutist abuses are vague demands like these. The state must be equipped with the kind of overwhelming power in comparison with which the power of each individual is infinitely small, or the state must exercise its power over its people in a manner which is so severe that they will willingly accept the burden imposed on it, etc. Gomplowicz went the farthest in expressing this concept of power. His sociological theory of the state viewed the state neither as an organism which grew naturally, nor as a historical manifestation of the spirit of the nation, nor as the result of a social contract, etc. What he presented us with was instead, by and large, a legal order imposed on a subjugated group of people by other victorious conquering groups of people. The purpose of this legal order is to fortify the domineering and exploitative relationship over the long run, and to preserve the subjected people in a manner which enables them to continue to render service. Thus, it is quite consistent to hear Gomplowicz say, "The state possesses power and not the right, although it creates, develops, and fosters the latter." while Merkel proposed that legal questions are not questions relating to the power positions of contending parties, but questions to be judged in terms of the truth of what they are maintaining and of the value of their claims as seen by a higher forum, Gumplowicz regards that as applicable to the area of private law, but not to the law of the state. For the state there is no higher forum. He who tries to combine the state and private law within the overall concept of law will never rise above doubts and confusion, and he will find himself in the unhappy situation where, in deference to law, he will end up coming into conflict with the most vital interests of his nation and of the state. That clearly commits one to the policy of might over right, where the reason for the state's existence and its interests and purposes permit it to use any means at all to achieve its objectives. Such a logical consequence, which goes counter to the legal philosophy of all nations, demonstrates clearly the scientific untenability of the premises underlying Gumplowicz's case. 5. With regard to the more active involvement of forces which are organized according to occupation, one gets the feeling that we may begin to speak again about a time when the power of the state will be reduced. The accumulation of power in the great economic associations was a basic idea underlying the German movement toward worker councils. There is also talk in the theory of the pure state about a threefold structuring of the social organism, where a limitation of the state to providing of legal order was expressed, whereas the structuring of economic and cultural life was to be left to autonomous organizations. We, too, are of the opinion that occupational organizations will come to play a greater role, in an updated form, than has been the case in modern era. That does not suggest by any means a complete elimination of the state or of its role in public law, culture, and welfare. 6. The state, too, must recognize, respect, and not violate private law or the economic independence and the civil and private economic liberty of its members. It must never be forgotten that we are dealing here with the natural rights of citizens, which may not be arbitrarily and capriciously limited, suppressed, or abolished. That applies as well to individual citizens as to associations. Mankind is not looking for suppression, but for protection of its natural rights, its natural freedom, and its own unique worth within the realm of the political society, the state. Every unnecessary, arbitrary restriction of freedom and of private rights goes against the purpose of the state, because it reduces the capacity for independent activity in working out one's own private welfare, and it stifles private initiative and limits the welfare of its citizens instead of promoting it. The principle of order is justice, and that means, in fact, justice toward all of society as well as toward each of its individual members. Suum cuique. Wherever private rights collide with the rights of the community, they must yield to the public right, which is higher on the basis of the principle of conflict of rights, but never more than is necessary to come to grips with the conflicting rights. Thus, for example, the elimination of private ownership of a parcel of land, etc., can be required by the public welfare as the expropriation of something can be justified. What happens then is that it is not the value residing in that parcel of land, so long as it is owned by the private owner, which comes into conflict with the public welfare. Therefore, the private owner is entitled to receive full reimbursement for the value of the land. 7. There is a twofold consideration which we wish to stress finally. A. When the state, as a political society, provides for the protection and help of its members, it is self-evident that these members, for their part, must also forego the temptation to pursue their own interests at all costs without regard for others. Otherwise, living in society would end up being detrimental to many members. Therefore, the protection which the state as a society exercises is not directed merely against other states and nations, but also specifically against suppression and brutality in the internal relationships among its members, so that it strives for a harmonization of opposing interests. B. For the state to provide help and protection does not mean capricious, arbitrary, or sporadic action. We are dealing instead, in the final analysis, with a complex of institutions, arrangements, and definite activities, as well as with ongoing conditions which guarantee the kind of protection and help which is continuous and at the same time geared to the needs of the present as well as to making steady progress. 8. State policy and economic and social policies. In the broadest sense, policy is understood to mean practical dealing and prudence in the selection of means toward the given end. In this sense, we may also speak of the policies of private parties, of organizations within the state, etc. In the narrower sense, the word policy is meant to refer to the state, and It refers to the prudence of the state in the way it operates and in the choice of means with reference to the preordained task of the state's organization. And that includes the way in which the state protects itself by its defense posture toward the outside world, external policy. It also includes internal policy, establishing, maintaining, and providing the kind of order which is in keeping with the purpose of the state. Internal policy has to do with a proper legal order, that is, providing a system of laws and seeing to it that this system is adhered to, and with providing for the general welfare. Internal policy, therefore, includes the kind of economic and social policy which is of special interest to us here. Economic policy embraces the endeavor of the state, using the means available to the entire community, to bring about and safeguard the fulfillment of the economic process, the process of providing material goods for the nation in a manner which corresponds to the national welfare. If we take the expression social policy in the broader, in fact, too broad sense, then we mean by it the activity of the state which involves the protection of rights, but which moves beyond the simple protection of rights to the protection and the promotion of the welfare of the people overall. So we are dealing with activity of the state that is dominated by the social perspective. Actually, the expression social policy is used commonly today in the narrower sense as being limited to the protection and promotion of social groups, estates, and classes, in terms of supporting them economically and socially, with reference to their social status, the preservation and strengthening of the middle class, providing order in labor relations and in the labor contract, as far as its legal prerequisites are concerned, its legal and economic content, and the corresponding order in production. Specifically, we think in terms of the goal of social reform and social policy in the narrowest sense, dealing with contentions, the proper relationship between profit-making groups and occupational groups, and the attempt to once again tighten the bonds of community which have been so loosened. The history of social policy, therefore, is scarcely exhausted by reference to the struggle to get enough food, as Zombart expressed it, as opposed to the struggle to secure the place to get one's food, which is supposed to constitute the sum and substance of national policy. Economic and social policy as a practical matter do not allow themselves to be distinguished in clear-cut fashion. They are very much interrelated. Since we will be dealing later with economic and social policy, we shall be satisfied with the foregoing observations for now. 9. State socialism. In principle, the purpose of the state and the functions of state authority are the same always. However, in their historical context and in the specific form which they take on, the tasks and accomplishments of the state will take on different forms. One form if there is a prevalence of individual production by the isolated individual, another if the self-contained family unit prevails, and still another where economic intercourse extends further beyond the limits of the village and the city, and another once the entire nation is bound together by a manifold bond of solid economic unity. This growing historical extension and complication of the state's tasks may contain within itself the danger of transgressing proper limits, but it by no means militates against the justification of the state's existence as based on the natural law. Instead, it emerges precisely as the historical fulfillment of this purpose in accordance with the changing historical conditions of the public welfare, and the need for state protection and assistance as these change and grow from one stage to the next. You are face to face with unacceptable state socialism once the state no longer wants to recognize the area of private rights and the private economic sector as one that is circumscribed by natural rights, even vis-a-vis itself, rights which are prior to all state authority and all positive legislation passed by the state, and which it must therefore respect and protect, and never violate. In other words, when the state places itself in the position of society and makes itself the subject of the national economy, so that it transforms the economic process to a greater or lesser degree into a function of the state's economic apparatus. Basically and essentially, state socialism involves the negation in principle and the practical endangerment of the legitimate status of the private economic sector. And ultimately, it is rooted in the theoretical denial of or disregard for the natural law, natural justice, and therefore any basic restriction on state activity and state control over the economy. It does not add up to state socialism, therefore, if the state limits the freedom of its citizens, where the protection of the rights of private individuals and the community obviously calls for such limitation, e.g., by legal regulation of private enterprise in order to safeguard the rights of workers. It is not state socialism if the state strives to offset the rival interests of various groups or classes on behalf of the general welfare. It is not state socialism if the state requires of its citizens that they also make positive contributions to the community in conformity with the norms of distributive justice. And it would not be state socialism if the state were to take over property or productive enterprise that was hitherto private, assuming full reimbursement of the value of what is taken over, if the need for such nationalization is clearly demonstrated by economic necessity, i.e., when there is a general need which can no longer be satisfied by private enterprise, at least not in a manner which would not involve danger and harm to the public. It is not state or community socialism if public bodies in or near the area of the city acquire property to safeguard broader legitimate interests, insofar as other ways and means may be lacking or inadequate. Nor can it be ascribed to socialistic tendencies if a rural community owns or enlarges its holdings of forests, meadows, etc., to advance the private economic endeavors of its members, etc. However, it is state socialism when, by appealing to some alleged law, an encroachment by the state on personal liberty, private property, and private economic enterprise is treated as something which it is free to turn over to the state without regard to natural and well-established rights, and if freedom and private enterprise are restricted or bureaucratically controlled in a manner which is by no means based on the clear requirements of justice and the common good. We refer to something specifically as state socialism when nationalization no longer results from the nature of certain specific types of enterprise, or from special circumstances which would prompt making them public, as an unavoidable necessity for the satisfaction of the nation's needs, but where it arises simply as a means to solve directly the problem of distribution. It is not a foregone conclusion that branches of the economy which clearly can be operated efficiently in an economic and technical sense by state bodies ought to be so operated without further question. And there are also some basic limitations against state monopolization for financial purposes. State socialism goes well beyond the concept of the state. It authorizes or requires state intervention in the economic area which goes far beyond the limits established by the purpose of the state. And ultimately it would turn over the regulation and guidance of economic life almost entirely to state authorities. Catherine says, "The state socialists are distinct from the extreme or logically consistent socialists in that they do not propose that private ownership be abolished in principle, or that today's class distinctions should be abolished, or that today's social order is simply to be overthrown. According to them, it is only required that the state should eliminate present-day social antagonisms, and therefore take over as many of the means of production into state ownership or into direct state operation as serves that purpose. State socialism leaves the limits of the margin between private law and public law up to the discretion of state authorities. A tacit assumption of state socialism is that there is no natural law which is independent of the state, and that the right of private property in particular is only a positive right that is provided by state authority, so that it may therefore be revoked under given conditions. Another untenable assumption of the state socialists is their incorrect approach to distributive justice. They assume that the objects of distributive justice are not only public goods, but all goods in the state without exception, whether private or public. Therefore, it is their task to see to it that everyone gets to possess property, income, in accordance with his merits. That, however, is an incorrect and impossible requirement. Nevertheless, state socialism allows various gradations. In its most extreme form, it looks forward to a complete socialistic order, even though this is in the dim and distant future. But when that time comes, it visualizes the state and not society as the subject and operator of the economic process, just as for the present, unlike democratic socialism, it proposes a monarchical state authority. Furthermore, while democratic Marxian socialism strives for the socialization of production in one blow, the theory of catastrophe, even extreme state socialism promotes nationalization step by step in actual practice. It does not want to put aside private ownership of the means of production all at once. Instead, always just so many means of production are to be taken over by the state as may seem necessary to harmonize social conflicts as large-scale industry develops and makes this necessary.